a little bit of background tonight. We love to throw product events. We love teaming up with other organizations. Our mission statement at Save a Child's Heart is Tikon Alone, repair the world. And we believe that whether we're repairing it, or Dara's organization is repairing it, or any one of the organizations that you guys work for, hang out with, give money to, everyone's working to repair the world. And we work really hard at fostering these relationships. So when I met Dara, gosh, it must have been 2 or 3 months ago, she came over to me and we were talking. She was such a firecracker. I just fell in love with her the second I met her. And I said, I want you to come talk to these people that I know, meaning you all. And, a lot of people said to me, well, why Refugees International? You guys don't really deal with refugees. You deal with children with congenital heart conditions. But really, at the end of the day, we have a very special mission at SACH. We get to bring these children from all over the world, and we bring them to the hospital where they're loved and cared for, and their hearts are fixed. And sometimes they come with their parents, sometimes they don't, and they just make new friends there. But regardless, at the end of the day, when they're in Israel and they're in a hospital, they're happy, they're healthy, and they're smiling, and it's a really beautiful thing. But unfortunately, a lot of the children that we take in come from parts of the world that are not so awesome. A lot of conflict zones, a lot of refugee camps, a lot of war, a lot of strife. And that's where Dara comes in. Dara's mission at Refugees International. Go get it, Gucci. Dara's obviously mission at Refugees International is to bring awareness of the plight of refugees. And I think sometimes we forget at SACH because we have so much fun. And our mission is so awesome. And the kids we bring in are so happy to be healthy again. But we forget that we take them from places of conflict and we send them home to places of conflict. So I thought it would be really important tonight if Dara could come and talk to us about some of the things she's seen around the world in these places of conflict. I know she just got back from the camps in Mogadishu. Wow, Mogadishu. So she's going to talk to us tonight a little bit about her experiences. We're going to show a video, and then she's going to be here for the next hour to answer any questions and talk to you about anything you want. So there's an...
She's very excited about my being here, obviously. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out on the night of the monsoon, apparently, where we're all going to die. So I appreciate that you chose to spend your last night on Earth with your refugees. Thank you so much to Mike and MJ for inviting me to talk a little bit. I promise you it will be a very little bit about what we do at Refugees International. As MJ points out, the connection between what SACH does and what RI does is exactly that, is that Refugees International goes into these parts of the world where a lot of the people that you are helping either come from or end up. And so MJ asked if I could just come and shine a very small light onto that part of the world. Refugees International is an advocacy organization. We don't maintain field operations. What we do is we go out into the field. We meet with the refugees, we hear their stories, we assess their needs, and then we take their stories back to the policymakers in Washington or London, New York, here at the UN, people with the power to make a difference, because these are people who, for all intents and purposes, are voiceless, but are the most vulnerable people in the world. To that end, last year I went to 2 places. I went to Somalia, to Mogadishu, and to the Democratic Republic of Congo, up into the northeast, into the Kivu. So MJ asked if I could just tell you a little bit about my experiences there. As you can imagine, working with refugees, you do tend to find yourself in places in the world that are some of the worst places in the world. Obviously, Mogadishu would be at the top of that list, probably for a lot of people. And in Mogadishu, I was really struck by the incongruity of my life, in that I was there and surrounded by armed security guards, staying in a very high security guest house, and yet the people whom we were there to meet and to help were the most insecure and vulnerable people probably in the world. As you probably know of Mogadishu, this is a city and a country that has been wrecked by civil war for almost 20 years. Driving around Mogadishu was like no place I'd ever been. It's just a completely destroyed city where you just see buildings that are have been reduced to rubble. And every building that is reduced to rubble inside, you will find the makeshift shelters of people who have come there. Some of them have been there for years. A lot of them came during the famine of 2010, which I'm sure you all were very well aware of at the time. Then a lot of them came just last year during the fighting with Al-Shabaab, which was the terrorist group that was in control of Mogadishu until August 2011, when they were finally driven out. So there are, estimates vary, but they think up to 500,000 people living in these conditions. they all fled to Mogadishu to escape what was either war or famine, and ended up being just further victimized by a system of institutional corruption, which is unlike anything I've ever seen. The displacement camps in Mogadishu are controlled by these so-called gatekeepers. It's a de facto control, but they wield complete control over all of the camps. They're able to do this because a lot of the international organizations that operate and provide aid to Mogadishu operate by proxy because it's just too dangerous for them to go in there, so they'll hire local subcontractors. So these gatekeepers basically will charge the people rent, who are these displaced people who are there, and the rent is in the form of the international aid that they receive. So they'll come in and they'll get their tents and they'll get their food, and then the aid providers will go away, and then they'll be forced to give a portion of their food or their tents or whatever it may be to the gatekeepers who are in charge. We heard it compared to a quasi-slavery, and there's no question that was what we were seeing. Stories of entire camps of displaced people being sold from one gatekeeper to another. People who had survived the famine, the next year the rains came, wanted to go back to their villages, were not allowed to leave because the gatekeepers, obviously the more people you have in the camp, the more international aid you're going to get, the more money you're therefore going to be able to siphon. It's not uncommon to go into the market and you see WFP bags of rice being sold in the markets at a ridiculous price, and this is the gatekeepers making their profits. And as I say, I've been in the 2 years I've been with RI, I was in Libya during the war, I've been in Afghanistan, I've been in the DRC, as I said. I've never seen a system as corrupt as this one, and the people who are there really are commodities. There's very little health care provided. There's virtually no education for the children in these displacement camps, some of whom have been in there for 3, 4 years, 5 years. We met one little kid I was very struck by who had stepped on a landmine, had his leg shattered, had a terrible botch job, and he could barely walk. This kid was probably 12 years old. And the gatekeeper would not let him leave to go to the hospital because he was worried that he wouldn't come back, and therefore he loses someone and he loses his money. So it was, in my line of work, you see some pretty horrible things, but that was honestly one of the worst things I've seen, and it just shows you how these people who have already been victimized by conflict and by natural disaster are now being further victimized by a system that is completely unregulated. The good news about Somalia is that Al-Shabaab has been driven out. For the past year, believe it or not, things are starting to improve. They have a new government in place, a new president in place, who seems to be genuine about wanting to fix things. We met with members of the government when we were there. There is a will, there's a political will to try and make things better. So what we are doing now as an organization in Somalia is trying to push the Western nations who are funding this government, and particularly the United States, who gives a lot of money to the Somali government, but also is the largest donor to the United Nations that is involved in working with these people, to actually get in there and start to actually monitor what is going on, because for too long it has been allowed to be just, like the Wild West. And it was like the Wild West. I mean, you drive around and everyone on the street seems to be walking around with an AK-47, and it was just like no place I'd ever seen before. And it'll take a while for it to get better, but it needs to be fixed, and the international community needs to do more to sort of step in. So, as I say, ending Somalia on a good note, because there is a lot of international interest in Somalia right now, and with interest there's a lot of international investment. If you turn on the news and you're hearing about Somalia these days, it's probably a good news story, but dry cleaners coming up and all this sort of thing, and that's great, and that's exactly what the country needs. Unfortunately, DRC is another story entirely, because as I'm sure you probably all know, Democratic Republic of Congo is a country that so many people, smart people, say is so broken that it can't possibly be fixed. And the reality is, my job is director of communications. It's much easier for me to sell a story about Somalia than it is to sell a story about the DRC. And I suspect a lot of little kitties at SACH YLG probably comes from these places in the DRC. When I was there in March, as I say, I was in the Kivus, which is an area in the northeast, which since, just a very brief history, because I'm sure most of you probably know it, but after the Rwandan genocide, it bordered Rwanda in '94, a lot of the Hutu genocidaires came into the northeast of Congo and started to really cause havoc. It led to 2 civil wars in the country that were, well, civil, except there were a lot of outside influences involved. Those ended in 2003, but ever since then, it has been a part of the country that has just been plagued by myriad different rebel groups. You probably, if you followed at all, Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, that's where they have been seeking sanctuary for the past almost 10 years now. When I was there in March, the regions, the villages we were there were the FDLR rebels, which were former Hutu Interahamwe, who were now causing havoc there. And again, it's just a part of the world that even though it wasn't as corrupt as what I saw in Mogadishu, it broke my heart a little bit more because you realize that this is a part of the world that has long been forgotten. And on that note, I'll just, the video I shot actually is the one I got from the DRC. If people want to,
we're gonna